Hi, this is Dr. Hudson. This presentation is designed to help you master the historical thinking skill, analyzing causes and consequences. Here I've listed the 6 historical thinking skills that we'll focus on in this course. This helps you put this particular skill in a broader context. Do you recognize this guy? It's Mark Zuckerberg. Now, if you don't recognize the name or his face, I'm certain you'll recognize the company, Facebook. In 2004, Mark and several of his college friends started doing some software experimentation in the Harvard dorm. And lo and behold, what emerges soon after that is Facebook. Now think, how many lives have been changed in less than a decade from that accomplishment? And think, as the 21st century continues, how many changes are going to continue because of Facebook. Now, in 1861, Americans took up arms against each other. 4 years later, over 600,000 Americans had died in the Civil War. Imagine how many people's lives were affected in some way by that decision. As the 19th century continued and well into the 20th century, imagine how many lives were changed because of that decision. How? Why? Everybody, not just historians, want to know. We want explanations for unusual accomplishments like Facebook or particularly terrible tragedies like the Civil War. The film The Social Network was an effort to explain the relationship between Zuckerberg and Facebook. And if you saw that film, you know it's a fairly complicated relationship. Countless films and books have been produced seeking to explain the Civil War. We want explanations. We want explanations for even less consequential decisions and behaviors, especially if they affect us. This is a section division. When you reach a slide like this, the presentation will automatically stop, and you decide if you want to continue with the new section, which is titled, or if you prefer to go back and review the previous section. The central question for this skill is, how do we explain the effects of decisions and actions that were taken in the past? We do this by analyzing causes and consequences, which is one of the 6 historical thinking skills that you will develop and demonstrate in this course. As demonstrated previously, history is about change over time. It's about understanding change over time, explaining change over time. Analyzing causes and consequences is a skill that seeks to explain the how and why of that change, and it's people that facilitate that change, either individuals or groups, and their actions that create change. And this is referred to as human agency. And people do this in all kinds of ways. People advocate for change, people shape change, people resist change, but it's people who create change. Analyzing causes and consequences will require asking questions and seeking explanations for this human behavior that facilitates change. But now the key concept is behavior, actions, decisions that facilitate change. This section defines the skill basics. All historical thinking skills involve asking questions. Analyzing causes and consequences requires asking questions that help you identify and evaluate. In asking questions that identify, the first thing we want to identify are the people. Who is involved? These can be individuals, but also groups and organizations. If you think back to the original examples of Facebook, and we start asking who, Mark Zuckerberg is an obvious answer, but there are many more individuals and many more groups. And the Civil War, of course, endless groups to consider. For example, slaveholders, non-slaveholders, states, political parties, abolitionists, etc. But we want to identify who is involved in making the decisions. In addition to identifying people, there's a need to identify forces. And forces, I just mean cultural influences. What forces were involved in shaping the people that are involved? The social, the economic, natural, and by natural, thinking about the geography, the environment the people live in, and the historical forces that shape the people. In the case of Facebook, we'd have to identify the technological changes. The social forces would be the desire to connect with other people like yourself in college. And then, of course, it became the economic desire to make money by combining these two, the social needs and the technological capacity. Analyzing causes and consequences also requires understanding that people and forces interact with each other, and that interaction needs to be evaluated. This is an illustration of that interaction between people and forces. When people act, of course, they don't transcend their human limitations. They don't act by waving magic wands or operating with infinite possibilities. People act in a particular context. And this context shapes people's motives, their beliefs, their options. Thus, a context both imposes limitations as well as creates opportunities. And the context in which people operate is shaped by a host of these forces: social forces, political forces, economic, geographical, environmental, historical. Thus, the interaction between people and forces. Analyzing causes and consequences requires asking questions, identifying people and forces, and evaluating the interaction between people and forces, which creates the context. And the people, forces, and context are all interacting with each other. It is not a linear relationship. And that's also true of these skills of asking questions, identifying, and evaluating. Which brings us back then to questions we could ask about this interaction. What are the motives of the people? The stated motives, the unstated but implied motives. What are their beliefs? What are their options and the limitations that have been imposed by the context in which they operate? All of this requires making reasoned judgments and justifying those judgments. This section adds complexity to the skill basics. Also remember, there's no formula for human behavior. Human behavior is complex. Consider the cultural forces mentioned and the idea of people making choices. How deterministic are these social, economic, and historical forces relative to individual decision-making power? So this requires judgments, weighing these two, balancing them. Cultural forces influence versus individual freedom to choose. When considering the consequences of decisions people make, remember that they're not always in control of the results of their actions. Thus, choices, decisions have unintended as well as intended consequences. For example, consider the Civil War. One of the consequences of that war was the emancipation of slavery, and the Confederacy initiated that war. And we'd be pretty safe in assuming that that was not their intention. And there's a common assumption that since the Confederacy didn't intend for slavery to end, but that was a consequence, it must have been the intention of the Union. And that was not the intention of the Union, certainly not initially. And that's an example of how you have to look for the complexity when analyzing consequences. And understand that consequences can't always be explained by someone's intentions. Consequences are results. The meaning of the word tells us that. Causes precede consequences. Again, the meaning of the word indicates that. Therefore, causes are antecedent events, simply meaning that causes occur before consequences. The question is, are all antecedent events causes? Another consideration that adds complexity to analyzing consequences involves understanding that there are differences between antecedent events and causes. Consider this example. Did the 2000 presidential election, which is an antecedent event, cause the 9/11/2001 terrorist attack? No argument has been made that the 2000 election was a cause of the 9/11 attack, even though the election was an antecedent event. So that's a simple one, but this is something that can easily trip people up and lead to faulty analysis. The caution also applies in the other direction. Consequences are the result of decisions and actions. Therefore, consequences are after-the-fact events. So the parallel question is, are all after-the-fact events consequences? Consider this example. Was the Scopes monkey trial in 1925 a consequence of the Prohibition Amendment ratified in 1919? There is no relationship between these two events. Again, this is a straightforward example that illustrates not every event that comes after an action or decision is a consequence of that action or decision. This section offers a concluding mantra. Always remember, history is not learning facts. Historical thinking, in this case, analyzing causes and consequences, requires that you think, that you ask questions, that you make judgments that require reasoning, and that you explain those judgments. Yet, historical thinking is not simply issuing opinions, which are personal preferences, but historical thinking leads to interpretations. Interpretations that reflect a point of view that can be challenged and disputed. History is controversial.